Welcome. We're so glad that you're here on a very snowy Friday. My name is Quinn Meekum. I direct our academic programs here at the Kennedy Center. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to a lecture and discussion with Professor Joshua Kertzer, who teaches at Harvard University. We're going to be talking today about perception and misperception in the role of international conflict. I want to just share a couple of our upcoming events with you so that you have some options for next week. Next Wednesday at this same time in this room, we're delighted to hear from Professor Milan Cvolik from Yale University, who is going to be discussing the role of the citizen as a check in democratic governance. He's a scholar of authoritarian regimes and will be joining us next Wednesday as part of our regular lecture series in Building and Brokering Peace. Also in this room, Thursday next week at noon, we're delighted to welcome Karima Benoon. She is a professor of law at the University of Michigan, and she will be speaking as part of our lecture series in conjunction with our Global Women's Studies Colloquium on the topic of gender and apartheid, or gender apartheid in Afghanistan, and the role of international law in addressing some of the challenges of the current Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to invite Cristina Blanco, who's majoring in Middle East Studies, to offer an opening prayer. Cristina.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for all that we've been given, this wonderful day, this beautiful snow. We're thankful for the opportunity that we have now to hear this lecture of conceptions and misconceptions in an international conflict interpretation. We ask if they could please bless all of us with open minds and open hearts. Please bless us to be able to broker peace in our immediate circles and within the global space. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you, Cristina. I am really excited to introduce you to Professor Josh Kertzer. Professor Kertzer is the John Zwaanstra Professor of International Studies and Government at Harvard University. He's been at Harvard for now over a decade. He's one of the leading figures in the academic study of international relations, an extremely well-known and prolific scholar. He's also a political psychologist and thinks a lot about the role of the intersection of political behavior and international relations and international conflict. And so his topic today will help us to see international relations in part through the lens of political psychology. He is a native of Alberta, Calgary, Alberta, and is delighted to be back where there are mountains. And we've given him a nice snowy day to be here. And I appreciate those of you that took the time to come out on a Friday afternoon and participate. We are going to go until 1 p.m. today. We'll save about 15 or 20 minutes of that time for questions and discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kertzer to BYU.
Thanks so much, Professor Meekum, and thanks so much to all of you for coming out on a Friday afternoon. I'm super excited to be here, be back in the snow and in the mountains. So what I'd like to do today is I want to talk a little bit about perceptions in international politics. And before I get into what I want to say, I want to start with a story. Normally, so when I teach psychology of international politics at Harvard, and normally, when I ever show this slide to folks, I ask people to identify who is who, and usually people say George W. Bush and Saddam Hussein. I ask them, yes, but which one is who? And they're still able to get that. But so the Iraq War, is I think a really interesting phenomenon if you study American foreign policy, right? And the question of why the U.S. went into Iraq in 2003. There are lots of answers you might offer to this question. One answer has to do with because the U.S. fundamentally misunderstood Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein fundamentally misunderstood Washington. On the U.S. end, right, the U.S. was convinced Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, right? Iraq did not have WMDs. But the interesting puzzle is, if Iraq didn't have WMDs, why didn't they just say they didn't have WMDs, right? The way political scientists have wrestled with this question, the answer seems to be that Saddam Hussein's statements about WMDs weren't actually signals to the United States, they were signals to Iran, right? It was about maintaining Iraqi deterrent capabilities with respect to Iran, and he sort of assumed, well, look, the U.S. is like a global hegemon, the U.S. is a global superpower, the CIA knows everything, of course they know that we don't actually have weapons of mass destruction. We don't even need to talk about this, right? So this story is interesting to me as an example of thinking about the role that perceptions play in international politics. And what I want to do today is I want to talk about sort of two things. So first of all, I want to talk about perceptions. What does it even mean when we talk about perceptions in international politics? I want to talk about what they are, why I think they're really interesting to study, but also challenging to study. Then what I want to do is I want to talk about two kinds of misperceptions in particular that are particularly interesting or important. One has to do with perceptions about the state of the world. The other has to do with perceptions about relative capabilities. And then in the Q&A, we're happy to get into all sorts of other kinds of perceptions that might be relevant, but that's the roadmap for today. Sound good? Sound good. Okay, great. So when we talk about perceptions, what are we talking about? We're talking about perceptions as an actor's mental representation of a given stimulus, right? This could be about the situation that an actor is facing. This could be about perceptions of other actors. It could be about your beliefs about your own attributes or characteristics, right? Self-perception. And I think the reason why perception is interesting is some of you, many of you have studied questions in international politics before, right? You've taken IR classes maybe, and you engage with them in sort of some respect, right? So I think one reason why it's really interesting to talk about perceptions in IR is because we can contrast it with explanations where perceptions don't actually play a role, right? There's lots of theories of international politics where you just study the world out there as it is, right? And why would you even bother getting inside people's heads? But when you're talking about perceptions, you're acknowledging that there is a possibility that there is a disconnect, right? The reason why you need to study what goes on inside people's heads is because different people see the world differently, and you can't just look at the world stage. You need to actually go inside the minds of the folks who are making decisions on it. So in this sense, right, when we talk about perceptions, it also raises the possibility of misperceptions, right? That an actor's mental representation will be incorrect. There's lots of examples here you can think of. The Iraq War example I just talked about, but also think about the U.S. Misperceiving how easy post-war reconstruction would be in Iraq. Think about the Israelis misperceiving Egyptian plans in 1973. Think about Britain misreading Hitler in the 1930s, right? These are all instances of misperceptions in international politics. There are lots of amazing scholars in American politics who also study misperceptions, and many of whom are actually here at BYU. Studying misperceptions in domestic politics is a lot easier than studying it in foreign policy, right? Because in domestic politics, typically when people talk about misperceptions, we're in this world where there's something that's obviously right, or maybe not obviously, but there's something that is right, and there's something else that is wrong, right? And so this, for example, this is Barack Obama's birth certificate. Right? And so there were misperceptions about that at some point in American politics. But more broadly, this is survey data from, I think, the 2020 election, showing different kinds of misperceptions that Republicans had on the one hand and that Democrats had on the other. These are cases where there's a right answer, there's an objective baseline, and there's a wrong answer. And so it's really easy to study misperceptions because you know who's perceiving things correctly and who isn't. In contrast, in IR, it's a lot harder to figure out what the objective baseline actually is, right? 100 years later, we still can't agree on what the causes of World War I were, right? So in this sense, when we study misperceptions in IR, sometimes it makes more sense to not talk about misperceptions per se, but to talk about perceptions more broadly. So I think there are three ways that folks sometimes wrestle with this in international politics. The first way to study, the first strategy you could use to study misperceptions or perceptions in IR, what you do is you compare the perceptions of multiple actors in a given situation. So, for example, this is from Pew polling data from 2004, asking Americans and asking French and asking Germans what they thought the causes of the Iraq War were. Right? Here, doesn't really matter who's right and who's wrong. That's not what we're interested in. What we are interested in is that we have multiple observers seeing the exact same situation and they're defining it differently, right? And so maybe it's not coincidental here that Americans perceive the causes of American behavior in Iraq to be different than how Europeans were perceiving it. Similarly here, this is from a study that was looking at surveys of Germans, Israelis, and Poles for their attributions for the Holocaust. And again, it should maybe not be surprising that Germans sort of tell a different story for what the causes of the Holocaust were than Israelis do or Poles do, right? This is again here, right? It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's simply saying, look, when we have variation in perception of the exact same situation, that's theoretically interesting. Another strategy that you can use is you compare multiple actors in the same situation to assess their aggregate coherence. So this is a newspaper headline from the beginning of World War I. And one thing that's really interesting about World War I is it's a war where every country assumes that this is going to be a really short war, right? People say, oh, soldiers, they're going to be home by Christmas. And every country assumed that this was a war that their side was going to win. Right? So not everyone there can be right. So again, you're looking at one situation, and this is an instance where someone's perception has to be wrong, right? Someone probably is going to be losing this war. Similarly, think of the War of 1812. Canadians, the British, the Americans, Native Americans all have a different story about who won that war, right? This, again, is another kind of instance where by simply looking at the same situation and sort of showing that not all these perceptions can be right at the same time, that probably indicates that there's something interesting worth studying. Another thing that you can do is you can look at an individual perceiver, and you can focus on how coherent their perceptions are. So this image here, this is a Chinese cartoon from the 1950s. This is about the United States as a paper tiger. The idea behind the paper tiger image, this is a common image that we see in IR. It's the same image that Osama bin Laden had of the United States in the 1990s, say. Right? Also, Ronald Reagan had this image of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The idea behind the paper tiger image is, there's this adversary. They're really strong, but they're also really weak at the same time, right? And so if you push them, they're going to fall apart, right? Probably both of those statements can't be true at the same time, right? That's another instance then of why by focusing on studying the perceptions of within a given observer, you can find something interesting. Okay, so I want to focus on, I says 3 there, but I only have time to talk about 2 types of perceptions. The first kind of perception that I think will make this sort of really concrete for thinking about how this matters in international politics, I want to focus on perceptions about the state of the world. And so here, the example I want to talk about is the idea of what sometimes maybe some of you have taken this in a security class, causes of war class, right? But it's the idea of the offense-defense balance. So what's the offense-defense balance? Basically, this is a perception about whether the offense has the advantage in war or the defense, right? Is it easier to destroy and invade something or to defend and protect something, right? So think here about the difference between cannons and castles, right? Are cannons an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon? They're an offensive weapon, right? The point of having a cannon is to blow holes in the wall of something, right? What's the point of having a castle, right? Other than to live in a castle, I suppose, right? It's defensive, right? You have these really thick walls so that it's hard for people with cannons to come and blow holes in them. Think also about machine guns versus trenches, for example, right? Machine guns, they're an offensive weapon, right? They're about moving forward, right? Trenches are a defensive device, right? They're about sort of maintaining your position. So the implication here is that sometimes we're in a world where the offense has the advantage. Sometimes we're in the world where the defense has the advantage, right? Are you better off in a world having a cannon or better off being in a world having a castle, right? But this has clear important implications for international politics, right? Because the more of the advantage that the defense has, the less of an incentive that you have to fight, right? If you're in a world where the offense has the advantage, what should you expect to see, right? You're going to see lots of wars. There's going to be a first mover advantage, right? There's an incentive for you to strike first because you're going to be able to make serious headway. Wars should be frequent, they should be short. You're going to be more likely to see arms races. If there's a high chance of you being attacked, you're going to want to stock up on weapons, form alliances in advance, right? So offensive defense balance questions are kind of hard to measure. So in an objective sense, they're a little bit tricky, but where I think they become particularly important, right, is as a perception, right? So oftentimes offense-defense balance questions are used to explain the causes of World War I, for example, right? Every military in Europe thought that recent technological developments would mean that there would be sort of serious offensive advantages. And so that's why you saw lots of arms races, you saw lots of secret alliances in the lead up to the war. But instead, what did World War I end up being about? It ended up being about trench warfare, right? So the defense actually ended up dominating, and that's why the war ended up taking so long, right? In contrast, right, so if everyone before World War I thought that the offense would have the advantage, before World War II, what did people think, right? They assumed, well, look, we've learned the lesson from World War I. Obviously, the defense is going to have the advantage. Instead, we ended up with blitzkrieg, right? We ended up with offensive tactics, right, being sort of really, really useful, right? So this is another instance of sort of thinking about perceptions. But here, what we're talking about perceptions about the state of the world. So the second kind of case that I want to talk about has to do with perceptions about capabilities. And here I want to talk about overconfidence, or positive illusions, it's sometimes called. And so here, one thing that's really interesting when we talk about overconfidence is that this is an instance where like the psychology of how ordinary people make decisions actually plays a huge role in international politics as well. We know in political psychology and in psychology more generally that people in their daily lives tend to be pretty overconfident about things. For example, there are studies where, and this doesn't apply at BYU, obviously, but there are studies where 94% of professors in college think of themselves as being better teachers than average. Mathematically, it probably is not the case that, well, it cannot be the case, right, that 94% of people will be better than average at something. 80% of drivers think that they're above average. I've never met anyone who self-identifies as a bad driver other than me. I'm definitely a bad. Okay, I have another fellow bad driver. I'm here in the audience. In studies of medical students, usually what people tend to find is people who think that they're people who end up getting like a D+ on an exam tend to think that they're actually going to get a B+ instead. Usually, the way this is illustrated, this is sometimes called Dunning-Kruger, right, is folks at the top are pretty good at predicting how they're going to fare, but when you are in like lower quartiles, you tend to overestimate your capabilities, right? Sometimes these studies have really small sample sizes, so you don't want to put too much weight on them, but there have been surveys, for example, of 1 million high school students in the United States that found that 70% of high school students rated themselves as being above average in their leadership abilities. Only 2% of high school students said that they were below average in their leadership skills, right? I should ask all of you sort of where do you put yourself on your leadership abilities, right? 60% of high school students said that their athletic ability was above average, right? Only 6% said that they were below average. 60% put themselves in the top 10% of athletic ability. 25% of them put themselves in the top 1%. So this is an instance where we are overestimating our capabilities, right? We think we're better than we actually are. In general, here's a fun fact about overconfidence in psychology you might not be aware of. Basically, what we think is that people tend to be especially overconfident in their personal lives in 3 domains. Does anyone know what the 3 domains are? Number 1 is about your own abilities, which are the examples I just talked about. Number 2 is your belief in how much control you have over events. People sort of overestimate how much control, how much sort of, they assume like their life is like within their own destiny, right? Like they're sort of forging themselves. And number 3 is optimism about the future. Actually, this is another fun fact. One thing that we know as well is the only people who don't fall prey to, the one sort of set of folks who don't fall prey to overconfidence are people who are clinically depressed, because they actually perceive the world like it actually is. So there you go. You can take that with you. But what I want to emphasize for today is that this same kind of overconfidence that we see in international politics also plays a role, that we see in our daily lives rather, also plays a role in international politics, right? So let's think back to that World War I case that we talked about a couple of minutes ago, right? That's an example of a broader linkage that we see between war and mutual optimism, right? Usually at the beginning of the war, if you were to ask folks on both sides, what's the probability that they're going to win, and you were to add those probabilities together, you're going to get a lot more than 100%, right? Mutual optimism is used to explain almost every war from 1815 to 1914. Think of the Boer War, think of Bay of Pigs, think of the India-Pakistan wars, think of Russia and Afghanistan, think of Iraq's attack on Iran, think of the Falklands, and so on. These are all wars where folks were overconfident when the war started, and it's because they were overconfident they ended up in this kind of conflict. Another way of thinking about this, so if you look at every war that's been fought since 1490, it depends slightly on how you code questions of initiation and victory, but basically initiators tend to lose between a quarter and a half of the wars that they start, right? If you're starting a war, you probably are pretty confident that you're going to win, or else you wouldn't try to start it in the first place. So the fact that you're losing half of the wars you start suggests that you're probably overconfident. Now, there's some questions in evolutionary models about how adaptive a trait is. There's arguments like maybe it's actually in in evolutionary context, it's better for people to be overly confident than underconfident, right? But these kinds of positive illusions are also related to misperceptions of intentions more broadly. So think of the Iraq War. Think where the U.S. sort of talked about, we're going to be greeted as liberators, right? So soldiers to be given like flowers and chocolate, right? Think of Russia before the war in Ukraine, right? The presumption in Russia was that the war in Ukraine would be super, super short. The presumption in Russia was also that Ukrainians wouldn't support Zelensky. That Russia would be sort of greeted as liberating folks from this regime that they didn't want, right? And this was not the case. There's some evidence that basically Russian intelligence had conducted polling operations showing that this wasn't the case, but this is a sort of part of a broader discussion about why democracies oftentimes tend to conduct better foreign policies than non-democracies do. Folks didn't want to pass this information up the chain because they knew this was not what Vladimir Putin wanted to hear, right? And so you might also sort of think about domestic politics and bureaucratic politics as a source of misperception in international conflict. But either way, this is another kind of instance of misperceptions relating to questions about relative capabilities. So I won't have time today because I want to really open things up for a broader discussion and hear from all of you. I won't have time today to talk about other kinds of misperceptions that might matter in international politics. We can talk about misperceptions about intentions, right? When I think the standard way that people sort of understood the Cold War was in these debates about what exactly the Soviets wanted, what was driving the Soviet Union, and these sort of fundamental models like the spiral and the deterrence model in IR are really models about questions about perceptions. Other kinds of misperceptions, things like intentionality bias. So one thing that we know is if I'm doing something to you and I'm imposing costs, the costlier it is, like the more negative the consequences for you, the more likely you think that I did it on purpose, right? So let's say we're passing each other, like walking outside, and I like bump into you like a little bit. If it's just like a little bit, you might think it was an accident. I'm just looking at the beautiful mountains because I'm so excited to be back with the mountains, right? But if it's like let's say you fall or something, you're gonna be like, oh, that mean Canadian, he definitely did this on purpose, right? And so there's a way in which we tend to assume that like, the cost of something is, the more likely we assume that it was done deliberately. Similarly, other kinds of misperceptions relevant in international politics. We oftentimes forget that other countries have domestic politics too, right? We're super aware, Congress and the president in the United States can't always agree on things, and there's gridlock, and we can't get things done, right? But we assume that that other countries are these unitary actors, and we sometimes forget that they have domestic political considerations as well. And we tend to sort of see our adversaries in particular as far more monolithic than they actually are. We forget that other leaders in other countries face domestic constraints as well. That's another kind of instance of perception in international politics. And more broadly, right, if we think that questions of communication and signaling matter in international politics, then in order for signals to be effective, right, you need to be able to decode the signal, right? You need to be able to figure out what was the messenger trying to say and should I believe them, right? And oftentimes we know that signals in international politics get lost in translation. So I will stop there, but I'm super looking forward to getting a discussion going, and I want to hear from you all as much, if not more, than you have been hearing from me.